This episode is brought to you in part by Reliance AI. Reliance AI streamlines privacy, data protection, and AI governance on one platform with advanced AI for live data mapping, processing activity records, and more. Visit reliance.ai. That's RELYANCE.ai. It's in the code. Welcome back to another episode of Data Protection Gumbo. Of course, you know me. I am your host, Demetrius Malbro, and today we have a great episode lined up around improving application security through better authorization. And there's not a lot of stories, but maybe there are too many stories around cybersecurity and authorization, confidentiality, integrity, all of those good things. But I do want to welcome Jake Moshinko, who is the co-founder and CEO of AuthZed, on to Data Protection Gumbo. Jake, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here today.
Awesome. So let's start off by giving the Gumbo listeners your story around co-founding AuthZed and how the journey was and how did you guys come up with the name and kind of where we are today.
Sure. So we decided that we needed to found AuthZed because we have struggled with authorization so many times in our past. So authorization, in case you're not aware, is understanding what the user that you're communicating with, be it at the other end of the internet or even in person, understanding what that person should be allowed to do. And this is contrasted with authentication, which is who you're actually talking to. So we've struggled in the past with authorization. So we build these products. We've had a couple products in the past. One of the products that we built was called Quay. Quay was the first private Docker registry. And the founders of AuthZed were also the founders of Quay. And when we built Quay, we built this platform. We kind of copied the GitHub authorization model. We just said, all right, we're going to have repositories. We're going to have these various access levels to the repositories. It'll be all good. Let's just copy what's already out there in the industry and, what could go wrong. And it turns out a lot can go wrong. So our very first feature request was, oh yeah, that's cool. You've got authorization, but now I need support for organizations. And I want to be able to put my repositories into folders. And I want to have folders within folders. And I want user groups. And I want groups within groups. And the problem just kind of spirals out of control. You just are constantly getting requests from users for finer grained authorization and more rich authorization. And on the engineering side, it can actually be a challenge to service these requests while maintaining a secure platform. So we struggled with this for a really long time. We built a bunch of code. It was all custom handwritten code. Nobody wants to touch it because it's security code, right? Nobody wants to be the one who's responsible for letting everybody in the world see everything. So it's kind of it gets this like esteemed status, right? You put the code up on a pedestal and you're like, nobody wants to touch the authorization code.
Yeah.
And so we struggled with that for a little while. We eventually exited the company to a company called CoreOS. CoreOS was working on a Kubernetes distribution, and authorization is really important there as well. So we just continued to struggle with this problem over and over again. Finally, we said, you know what? Let's just go and found a company to solve this problem. And we did just that. We've been doing that ever since.
Nice. Great story. And it sounds like you guys really did your due diligence around kind of getting to the place you are today. Jake, let's take a step back and kind of do a one-on-one level around maybe understanding the difference between, because I even get confused sometimes if I don't really think about it, authentication versus authorization, and maybe why that's crucial. But first, explaining the difference between the two.
Yeah, and we as an industry certainly don't do ourselves any favors by referring to them both as auth, right? People are like, oh, what are you doing for auth? And it's like, well, which part, right? So authentication is exchanging evidence for who the user that you think you're talking to is and evaluating that evidence and then making an assertion. I believe as a platform that I'm talking to Demetrius, right? So that's authentication, identifying who the person at the other end of the communication medium is. And you've gone through this at like your bank as well, right? You call them up and they're like, all right, well, what's your PIN code? What's your password? What city were you born in? Like all these kinds of, those are authentication questions. And you're supplying evidence that they compare against what they have on file. And then they say, I believe with some percentage of confidence that I'm talking to this person. Authorization, on the other hand, is now that I know who I'm talking to, what are they allowed to do? Right? You call up your bank, you identify yourself as Demetrius, and then you immediately say, all right, transfer $200 million from, a big bank's account to mine. And they're like, well, sorry, sir, you aren't actually authorized to transact on behalf of that big bank, right? So,
And I don't have the money anyway, but
well, you would if they let you transfer it from their account
oh
to
yeah, you're
yours.
right. You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So so authorization is now that I know who I'm talking to, what are they allowed to do?
Okay. Awesome, awesome. And I'm really trying to understand because right now there are lots of ransomware attacks and we're continually seeing just in the news all different types of challenges and issues. Like I remember 10 years ago we didn't really see a lot on CNBC and just on all of these news platforms. Every day there's someone talking about something that happened around cybersecurity, whether it's a ransomware attack or whether it's this debacle or this system is down or this thing accidentally happened and all these devices are wiped out. But we all know that there are some challenges around just overall maintaining the security of your data, your devices, whether it's a mobile device, whether it's an enterprise server or an IoT device. I mean, literally anything that connects to the internet has to be secured. And so, what are some of the challenges that you see in particular around implementing an effective authorization system?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that application authorization is only one of the ways that these systems get broken into.
Mhm.
Almost always there's like a human involved somewhere for the really big, really high profile things, right? They call up a human and they pretend to be someone else and that human does something wrong. But actually, broken application authorization is what OWASP refers to as the number one risk affecting web developers today. So this is applications that are overly broad, right? So
Mhm.
you're not allowed to federate things out in the way that you want, and so you end up giving people more access than they need. These are things
Right.
that are just outright broken, right? Like if you type in the right magical URL, you get access to something you shouldn't have access to. So like these are all some very high profile things. There was a story where OpenAI was actually allowing people to see each other's chat histories.
Yeah.
And everybody thought it was application authorization at the beginning, but it turned out that it was just a Redis client bug. But it
Mm.
was one of those things where I was like, oh man, I can't wait to throw this on some slide decks and pitch this. So there
Right.
can be a variety of ways that information gets shared inappropriately, but application authorization being broken is definitely one of the big ones.
Okay. And it seems to still be like very challenging and difficult to make sure that you have the right systems set up. And I also continue to see that there is a cybersecurity skills gap, that we don't have maybe enough skilled professionals because there's so many different jobs, so many positions out there. And as we see, just from a couple of weeks ago, there was an outage, right? And I mean, it was multiple different systems interacting with one versus the other. And so the whole interconnecting component of all of these systems, and especially the world is so digitally connected, that there has to be some type of way around putting in a proper system in order to make sure that this problem is solved around just authorization. Now, what are some of the best practices that you typically recommend to maybe a CISO or executive management around designing a robust system from the ground up?
Yeah, when I'm speaking to those levels, I usually focus on making sure that the system that you've got in place can scale with your organization.
Hmm.
So you want it to be able to scale with traffic, you want it to be able to scale with feature velocity, you want it to be able to scale with user requests, right? You want it to be able to scale geographically. So when I'm speaking to people at those levels, that's really what I focus on, like having something in place that you can put in now and that will grow with your company as your company grows, because everybody's scaling on one of those dimensions, right? Like even if
Mm.
your user traffic isn't going up, you've got some initiatives to drive that, or you're expanding into new geos to increase the size of your business, something like that. So that's what I usually focus on when I talk to like C-suite. But usually who we're talking to are application engineers or platform engineers. And when I
Okay.
talk to them, I talk to them about how they can bring more revenue to their business by solving authorization in a flexible, scalable way. And an example of that would be, let's say you have a SaaS and you've been selling that SaaS to small businesses, right? And you want to go into the enterprise, for example. The enterprise has very concrete, very specific ways that they think authorization should work, right? We're talking about things like user-defined roles, right? Instead of having read, write, admin, now you've got accounting and billing admin and auditor and read only, right? Like all these different roles. And they have very specific views about how those roles should work. And if you're not ready to be able to address those authorization challenges before you go into the enterprise, you're not going to win the deal. So that's what I talk to when I talk to product managers or the platform team or individual developers who are looking at bringing in an authorization solution.
Okay, what's the number one thing that you typically see them trip up on, right? There has to be like this one thing that may be so simple, or it may even be complex, right? That you continually see that as being a problem, which may also lead into one of the reasons why you guys founded AuthZed in the first place.
Yeah, well, what I just mentioned, user-defined roles, that's a
Okay.
really big one, right? So being able to make a role and name it whatever you want and give it whatever permissions you want. The other big one is recursive definitions. And when I say recursive, I'm talking about like folders that belong to other folders, right? Like in an arbitrarily deep hierarchy, or user groups that can belong to other user groups in an arbitrarily deep hierarchy. When you're doing simple authorization, you say, okay, I have an asset, I have a resource, and it can be shared with a group, right? And it's very easy to just do like a SQL join to bring the groups in, like join the groups with the resource and then say this person has access or not. But what if that group has other groups, which have other groups, which have other groups, which have other groups? Can you imagine writing that query? And can you imagine writing the code to understand the output of that query? So that's one of the ones. That's actually one of the ones that drove us to build AuthZed, because we had that exact challenge in Quay. And it's something that we actually never solved in one of our dimensions. We actually had to shelve some features, and we were never able to address that user demand.
Now, that sounds like RBAC, like role-based access control, and then even the biggest buzzword of them all, right? Zero trust. Is that, talk to me a little bit about both of those, and do you like that word, or do you use it, or do you hate it, or should we call it something else?
All right, well, I'll start with RBAC. RBAC is just one authorization model
Okay.
that you can use, and AuthZed supports RBAC quite well, right? It's actually very natural to model RBAC on our platform. And then zero trust is maybe the most loaded word that I like, the most loaded concept in the security space right now. The concept, as far as I know, started, or maybe the first practical implementation of the concept started at Google. And there was a system there called BeyondCorp, right? So if you rewind way back into the old days, everything you had corp, you had your corporate network, and then you had your prod network. And everything that your employees were doing happened on the corp network. And just having access to that network gave you a certain amount of access to the services that were running on that network, right? And then when we moved to BeyondCorp, that was saying, all right, let's take our corporate stuff and move it onto the production network. And then when we talk about zero trust, we can no longer rely on that network boundary in order to say that someone should have access to one of these corporate tools. So now we need to authenticate and authorize people for corporate actions the same exact way we would as if they were an end user coming through the front door of the wide open internet, right? So that's basically the core concept, right? Don't assume anything about the user from where they're coming from, and then move all of that traffic over to the production network and only have one network that you really focus on securing sort of uniformly, whether it's corporate or external traffic. So that's the issue at its heart. We certainly have a role to play in that posture, right? Like if you require a rich authorization for your end users, it's very obvious that when you bring your corporate users into the same flow as your end users, you're going to require a rich authorization for them as well. But it's not something that we like play into just because the word means so many things to so many different people. And I don't want to get mired in the wrong kind of conversations where people are like, well, you build yourself out as zero trust. What are you doing for network ingress? What are you doing for, these 10 other zero trust concepts that aren't directly related to like application authorization itself?
Okay. Insightful. What is your response to ransomware? Is there something that can be done just from an authorization perspective, or is that just typically more a social engineering breakdown where the human is involved and they get tricked, right? A phone call or whatever slick type of way that a bad actor will get access to the keys of the kingdom, right? And they have Active Directory and they can go in and have access to all the systems because they got access to that really important component of an enterprise, right? But do you see authorization as a part of maybe locking that down, or is there some other way that you typically see a ransomware attack go down?
I'm not a security expert when it comes to
Okay.
things like ransomware. One
Hmm.
thing I'll say is that there's nothing different here. It's about making sure that the people who you can actually get on the phone have the minimum viable permissions in order to be able to do things, right? Like if I call up a random employee from a company, they should not be able to give me access to Active Directory.
Mm.
And things like fine grained authorization, things like zero trust, they all kind of play. They're in when it comes to security, you always hear this concept of like security in layers or defense in layers,
Right.
right? So you want to make sure that one, that person doesn't have any privileged network access. You want to make sure that they've only got access to the very essential things that they need to do to get their job done. And AuthZed does play in some of those spaces, but it wouldn't be like bring in AuthZed and you won't get ransomware, right? Like it's just such a more nuanced topic than that.
Okay. And we can't close the episode out without talking about the biggest buzzword of them all today, artificial intelligence, right? Where do you see that fitting in, just as far as emerging trends are concerned? And will AI be leveraged more in order to kind of take the next step and get us to the next level as far as being able to better protect?
Yeah, I know that. So I used to work at Amazon, and I
Okay.
know that even when I worked there over a decade ago, they were already using AI to detect fraud
Mhm.
and do like transaction scoring and things like that. So I think there is a place for AI in the security world when it comes to things that are fuzzy and for things that have a heuristic. So, for example, authentication, I talked earlier about being able to present evidence. And you can have both positive and negative evidence, right? Like positive evidence is this person has the password for the account. And then negative evidence is that they're logging in from a part of the world that we've never seen them log in from before, right?
Mhm.
Like we should
Right.
probably score that. So that's what I mean by fuzzy and having a heuristic, right? Like you need to score all of that together and then make a decision. When it comes to authorization, I'm a little bit less bullish on AI, right? Like we've all seen examples of AI hallucinate. And when you called up the bank and you said, "Will you transfer $100 million over to my account?" You wouldn't really want an AI to be able to hallucinate in that scenario, right? Like you want
Right.
authorization to be pretty locked down, pretty ship shape. And so I'm a little bit less bullish. One of the areas where I see the opportunity for AI in our business is to sort of perform the work of craftspeople, right? So imagine you've got an integration problem, right? Like I have AuthZed on one hand, and then I have our application on the other hand. And how do I make the two meet? Right? Like how do I glue them together? How do I bind them
Mhm.
together?
Mhm.
And I think AI can potentially do a lot to get that process kicked off. Right?
Okay.
Like I think at least for the foreseeable future, humans will be involved in fine tuning that and double checking the AI's work. But yeah, I guess that's my thesis on AI right now, right? I don't want to
Mm.
put AI directly in front of the user or like put it in the critical path, but I like to have AI do work that I can double check, right?
Okay.
Like I like it to like generating source code is a great one because I can look at the code and I can be like, that looks like good code or that seems reasonable. It doesn't have any security flaws. But if it were like generate this code and then execute it on behalf of the user, that gives me pause just because we've seen so many examples of it kind of being a little wonky or hallucinating or whatever.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question here. I am really enjoying this conversation here. I always love having these nerd out conversations around things that my wife would say, why are you talking about that? Like no one cares, but she's not in the IT industry, so she doesn't
Yeah.
know. But I do want to
She
ask.
definitely cares when it's when we're on the other side of the conversation and there's a breach, or something of hers got
Oh
stolen
yeah,
or
right.
accessed or whatever, right? Like
Yep.
people care, they don't want to talk about the fundamentals of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's just like being able to call up her girlfriends and talk about whatever the latest sitcom or show was. I mean, they can go on for hours. And I was just watching one of the founders of Netflix, how they, back in '97, tested out the idea and then dream of the company getting to where it is today. And they approached blockbusters a few times, and they were like, "No way, we're not going to buy you. We're gonna compete with you." And then they ended up putting them out of business. But one final question around layoffs and just the industry. Where do you see the market headed, just from an overall cybersecurity perspective, just around layoffs and the challenges of people trying to find jobs and so many candidates being out there right now? What advice would you give to someone who's A, out of a job, B, they probably were laid off, C, they may have been out there looking for 6 months or longer, and they're in the cybersecurity space?
That's a tough one. I will say that I think layoffs from big tech have largely been a result of the Fed's prevailing interest rate. For a while, tech was the only place that money could go to seek a return.
Mm-hmm.
And now money has other options to seek a return. So I think that's a really big one. So we have to watch what the monetary policy looks like, right?
Okay.
So if interest rates start to come down, then money will start looking for returns again. And for the last 20, 30 years, tech has been a great way to chase returns. So I think that's where a lot of the over exuberance in the COVID era came from. We had the
Mm-hmm.
zero
Mm-hmm.
interest rate monetary policy. And then when that all got rolled back, it was very painful. All these companies looked and they said, well, we way overhired. We're no longer able to borrow this money essentially for free.
Right.
Right? Because you can, under that policy, you can essentially spend infinity money seeking revenue because the money is free.
Yeah.
Uh, so, I mean, you have that. And then the other thing that happened is AI came around and they said, well, we overhired. We know we overhired. And then now they're looking at the possibility that maybe some of these jobs can be automated. So they're
Mm-hmm.
like, man, we way overhired
Right.
because we may not even need a lot of these roles in a few years. So I think that's what kind of caused the situation that we're in. If you're a practitioner, what can you do? I would say look for small caps, look for startups, look for companies that maybe aren't the Magnificent Seven, or the companies that have been on your bucket list, because
Mm-hmm.
there's still growth happening there. Companies like ours, we're hiring. I mean, it's like crazy for us, but we're talking about like single digit numbers of people, right?
Yeah. Right.
But the smaller companies are hiring, right? We still have novel ideas. We're still seeing growth. We're still bringing personnel on to go and capture that. And a lot of the companies that have those assumptions about AI and what AI can do baked in from the very start, we're talking companies that were formed in the last 2, 3, 5 years. They
Mm-hmm.
won't, like, they'll have been hiring more judiciously from the start. So when you see a role posted at a company like that, it's probably more likely to be a real thing, right? Versus companies that might not have as many roles open. Does that help? I'm sorry.
Yeah. It helps. And you mentioned that you guys have a few positions open, right? Do you get involved at all, or do you just see the name come across the desk and sign off, and you just trust the people that your team who has interviewed them?
I get involved really heavily. I think it's
Okay.
one of the most critical things that I can be involved in. So we're a fully distributed company,
Okay.
and it's so important from a cultural perspective to get it right, and
Mm-hmm.
from a technical perspective. And because, like I say, we're hiring somewhat conservatively compared to, like, those Magnificent Seven huge companies. And so we want to make sure everyone that we bring in the door is, top tier, A plus contributor. So I get quite heavily involved in hiring.
Okay, and I'm sure as you guys scale, you'll probably step back and leave that to the VP of HR or the chief people officer, and you'll trust them enough, right? Because you're going to be too busy, right? You're going to be
Yeah.
too busy.
Funny story about that. I worked at Google for a little while, and at
Okay.
least when I was hired at Google, Larry Page still looked at every single candidate dossier for every person that was joining the company and personally signed off on it. So
Wow.
we're like a 20
Okay.
person company.
Yeah.
And at the time, Google was probably 10,000.
Hmm.
So I got a ways to go before
Okay.
I have to fully transition over.
Well, here's to reaching 10,000 employees, maybe in the next few years or so. You're probably gonna have a few other series investor rounds, right? I think I saw what 12 million was it?
Yeah, we took a 12 million Series A earlier this year.
Congratulations on that.
Thank
And
you.
I know it's a little challenging to get these funds, and I think they just opened the coffers on cybersecurity because I think things slowed down a little bit and then they picked back up. But I do appreciate the insight, some of the best practices, you taking time out of your day to join us right here on Data Protection Gumbo. And I want to put another plug in for the Backup and Recovery Professionals group on LinkedIn that I host, that I run. There's about 26,000 professionals in that group having conversations around cybersecurity, data protection, backup recovery, data storage. We even talk about tape and mainframes every once in a while, which they said was going to be dead, but they are still alive and kicking as well. So check us out on YouTube, Data Protection Gumbo, and also give us a thumbs up if you happen to check us out there. Also share it with your friend as well. So Jake, thank you so much for being a guest right here on Data Protection Gumbo.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Enjoyed the conversation.